Hello, my friend. I had no intention of making this video, but my friends on Twitter made me do it. I decided that this was a good thing for me to talk about and just kind of get some information out there. If you don't know the drama that happened this week with the James Charles and Morphe palette, here is the video that started it all.
I want to make it very clear. The hives that I'm getting on my eyes are not from my makeup remover or base. I've used both of the products for years. Never had hives from them. I use them literally every day. I got a sister sleigh wherever I go. But James did not warn me about the staining. He didn't tell any of us. I watched all his promotions on the palette. He didn't say that it would look like I have eyeshadow on still after I tried to remove it. I can safely say you should skip using the color Skip. People are trying to say because it's a pressed pigment that I should know that pressed pigments can stain. None of the others did this. Explain that, Mr. Charles. I don't care what formula it has, but you should never, ever, ever try to promote a product that does this to another human being.
That's a little clip of the video, and if you'd like to know my thoughts and my commentary on what she's saying, what James said in response, and what my opinions are, hang tight, we're getting into it right now. Here we go! Off into the controversial zone. Dee-dee-dee-dee, dee-dee-dee-doo. I didn't think I was gonna be singing that song ever again. Well, I knew I was gonna be doing a controversial video, but I really like that song. I think I'm gonna keep it. This is going to be a bit of a controversial video, but I really don't think that it should be. I think one thing before I get into this that I think is really important is that there's a big difference between being critical of a situation and attacking, and this is going to be a video where I'm going to be very critical, but it's not meant as an attack. It's meant as something to be helpful, especially to you, the person watching this video right now. When the palette released, I purchased it. I purchased it within the first 4 minutes of it being launched. It's actually on its way to my house right now. I have not received it, so this is not going to be a review of the palette. This is going to be just some discussion of the pigments that are in the palette and what that means. I have done a video like this in the past with the Manny MUA Lunar Beauty Life's Drag palette. This is going to kind of touch on some of those things and just let you know how the things I discussed in that video apply to this situation. So if you're curious about the whole shebang, I will link that video down below. The other thing I want to mention before I tell you my, the facts and my opinions is that we don't know what James knew and didn't know about these things I'm about to tell you when he filmed his video. James doesn't really do ingredients on his channel. He doesn't do reviews on his channel. He does tutorials and he does funny stuff with his brother and he does a lot of things that are not even makeup related on his channel. And I think that that's gained him this really wide audience. But to me, I feel like when you release a makeup palette to such a wide audience of people that may not be as familiar with makeup as those of us that have a huge subscription list of a bunch of different makeup channels, I think it's that much more important to be clear about what's in the palette, what's going on with it, and how it could affect the customer. I do also feel, though, that it was Morphe's responsibility to make sure that James had the best, most thorough information available so that he could properly present it to his audience. But again, we don't know what Morphe told him. We don't know what James knew. Only James and Morphe know that. All right, so here's the problem. Okay. James, in his launch video, talks about how there are many different formulas within his eyeshadow palette. That there's eyeshadows and then there are pressed pigments. Let me go ahead and show you a clip of that part of his video.
When I had this palette idea, I worked with Morphe very, very closely to formulate every single one of these shades to create literally the most bomb rainbow eyeshadow colors you will ever see in your entire life. Majority of this palette is beautiful, vibrant, pigmented rainbow matte shades. Now, I do want to touch on the matte shades and some of these formulas behind them because most of the mattes in this palette are considered pressed pigments and not typical eyeshadows. Now, what does that mean? I didn't know until very recently when I was formulating this with Morphe, but now I do, so I want to share it with you guys. The ingredients in pressed pigments are just slightly different than eyeshadows, and they are actually exactly what their name says. It is literally just the actual color pigment pressed right into a pan ready for you to use, whereas an eyeshadow has a lot of other stuff mixed in it as well to make it perform really beautifully. Now, that being said, by doing pressed pigments, it allows you to make the most vibrant, true to color product ever, and I am so incredibly proud of these. As an artist, I will say straight up to you guys, some of these pressed pigments are a little bit harder to work with just because you have to use slightly different techniques, but once you figure them out, they are so incredibly beautiful, and I know that you guys are gonna fall in love with them.
But what James doesn't mention is that the pigments that are used in his palette have not been FDA approved for the eye. Some of them. Some of them, of course, have, but some of them have not. You may have heard this before, especially if you watch my other video, that there are eyeshadow palettes that they can't call eyeshadow palettes because they have these pigments in them. So what they do is they call them pressed pigments palettes. This has happened many times before. The first time I remember it is from the Urban Decay Electric palette. I remember it happening with the Jeffree Star Blood Sugar palette. I remember it happening with the Manny MUA Lunar Beauty Life's to Drag palette. I'm sure that it has happened with many other palettes before. Those are just the ones I know off the top of my head. But what Manny and Jeffree did that James did not do is that they at least made some kind of mention of the disclaimer on the back of the box that says that some of the pressed pigments are not eye safe. James did not do that. Now, the way that Jeffree went about it was actually the most clear. Let's play a little clip from Jeffree's video.
Also, I do want to talk about, so this is a pressed pigment palette. So when you use a vegan formula, reds, pinks, purples, and that nature are really hard to perfect and make amazing. So if you want smooth, creamy mattes, you want the pigment to be off the chain, you've got to use red dyes, because if you are a vegan brand, you cannot use carmine. A lot of these red dyes can stain the eye area. So on the back of the box, you will see that it says some of the shades are not really allowed near the immediate eye area. So basically it is kind of a warning for people with sensitive eyes. So if you are someone that when you wipe off your makeup, you don't want like your lid stained pink or any like residue in there, then you might not want to put it around your immediate eye area. Nothing crazy is gonna happen. You're not gonna go blind, nothing wild. It's just legally I have to put that on there because there is red dyes in here.
Manny was a little less clear, which was kind of my gripe with it. He didn't quite talk about that they weren't FDA approved for the eye, which was kind of my gripe with it, but at least he did mention it. Let's hear what Manny had to say.
This product is cruelty free, which I'm so excited to be able to announce that as well. But I also wanted to shoot my shot basically at creating something that was vegan as well and create a palette that had no carmine in it, which is basically a byproduct of red beetles. So many brands use it. It's a very, very, very commonly used thing, but when you use carmine, you can't claim to be vegan because it is a byproduct of an animal. So when you're doing a matte shade or any kind of shade that involves some type of reds or purples or burgundies, anything like that, you have to use these red dyes, you know, red 40, things like that. So due to the fact that it is a red dye, it's a pigment, it is possible for it to stain the eye area, the immediate eye area, so there is a warning on the back of the palette. I have personally used them all and I have turned out fine. Do not have staining on my eyes, but if you are extremely sensitive, you could potentially have staining on your eyes. Urban Decay has their electric palette. MAC Cosmetics has pressed pigments as well. I legally have to say those red dyes potentially could stain your lids. Does it happen to me? No, not necessarily, but could it happen to someone that's really, 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 really sensitive? It could potentially. So basically I decided to make this decision because I did not want to have carmine in my products.
And if you remember from James's video, he made no mention of that some of the pigments may stain the eyes, that they were not FDA approved for the eyes. No mention of it at all. And again, I don't know if it's just that he didn't know or what, but it was his responsibility and Morphe's responsibility to make sure that that information was conveyed to the customer. Because if you look at the picture on the box, it says, it's got a little eye next to the eyeshadows, and in the pressed pigments, it's got a little symbol that says a little circle and then a no. I have never seen that on a box before for eyeshadow. It usually says something like the Urban Decay Electric palette did, which says that some of these pigments are not made for eye use. I've got some notes on some of the things that James said. He said that the pressed pigments are not typical eyeshadows. He says that he didn't know a lot about pressed pigments before he started working with Morphe on it, that they're slightly different from other eyeshadows. He describes the difference between a pressed pigment and an eyeshadow being that the pigment is exactly that it's pigment pressed, and that an eyeshadow is mixed with a bunch of other things. If you look at the two ingredient lists for James's pressed pigments and the ones that are called eyeshadows, you'll see the ingredient lists are almost the same. They're almost exactly the same. Now, we don't know what the concentrations are of pigment versus these other ingredients. I would assume that the pigments have more pigment in them than the regular eyeshadows, but we just don't know because they aren't required to give that information. No cosmetic brand is required to give that information. So we don't know, but just to say that it's just pressed pigment without other ingredients, and then you look at the ingredient list and see that there's lots of other ingredients, that's just straight, it's not true. It's not true. What is true though is when you use these dyes, these other red pigments and other pigments, it does give more vibrancy to the shadow. That is very, very true. Another thing that James said that is very true is typically when something is labeled a pressed pigment, it is more difficult to work with than a typical eyeshadow. The woman that you saw at the beginning of this video, her name is Cody, and one thing that she mentioned was that she didn't know it was gonna stain her eyes. And when James reacted to that on Twitter, he said it's common knowledge, and I honestly don't think that's fair. It may be for us that watch a lot of YouTube videos, but not for the average consumer. We are not the average makeup consumer when it comes down to it. I took a glance at Cody's YouTube channel. She does not do primarily makeup videos. She does a lot of comedy, like commentary kinds of videos. So it's totally possible that she didn't know. And I do feel like James is totally gaslighting the situation and minimizing the fact that she's upset about the way that his product performs. His reaction on Twitter to tell her to go to a dermatologist. This is my thought. My thought is if your product goes to the point where you're recommending that a person goes to the dermatologist as a reaction to the way that your product performed on them, that's a problem. I think maybe even just oh, I'm so sorry you're going through this. I'm sorry that you're having a bad experience. Make sure you go to your dermatologist. I mean, something. But he is totally not taking any kind of responsibility for it. And I think that that's a serious problem. And I know that a lot of people on Twitter have chimed in support of James, saying that she should have known better, but I do not feel that way. That is not my opinion. I'm not defending the content completely of Cody's video. There are things in there I feel like that are overblown. She's known for doing things in a very overdramatic way where she's got different cuts and one-liners and things. It's just her style. I'm not defending like who she is as a person. What I'm thinking about is a general customer who's having a difficulty with a product. And I can see why people might be confused because he never tells you that they're not meant for the eye. He never tells you that. And then he proceeds in future videos to use the pigments that are not meant for the eye, according to the FDA, on his eyes.
I'm first gonna grab an M433 brush and dip into the shade Escape, and I'm going to pop this right on the outer corner. Grab another M433 brush and dip into the shade Single, which is that lighter purple shade, and I'm gonna use this to lightly diffuse out the edges. I'm just going to grab an M441 brush and dip into B, which is the bright yellow shade. I'm gonna dip this shade right into the bright red, which is called You're Kidding. Why is it called that? You're gonna find out when I put this on. Formulating a bright red shadow is really, really hard. And I also feel like it's something that is always missing from every single palette. I feel like every red either reads burnt orange or magenta. And I was like, no, I want red. Like, is it that hard? And it was, apparently. I was wrong, but we did it and it looks bomb. Now that's
Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I can see where there would be a confusion there. Now, that being said, if you did see the video that I did for the Life's a Drag palette, I mentioned how the FDA is really outdated in updating these things. And for the majority of people, these pigments are not going to cause a problem other than possibly staining the eye. But there are people that do have an allergic reaction to pigments like this. So this is my take on it. If you release a product and people are having difficulty, even just one person is having difficulty with it, I feel like you need to own up and take responsibility and just at least say, I'm sorry you're having difficulty with it. Even if you don't feel like you personally did anything or whatever, it's not about that. It's about the fact that your palette has caused problems for somebody. and gaslighting that person and making them feel like their concerns and their issues and their irritation are not important, I think is wrong. So hopefully you found this video helpful. Again, I go way more in depth about Red 6 and Red 7 and the other red pigment that Manny had used in his palette in that video, and that'll be linked below if you do want to know more information. I'll also give you some research links, some FDA links, and things where you can look all of this up for yourself if you're curious, if you want to learn more. I'll put it all down there as much as I can fit. YouTube only lets so much in the comment box. I'll put as much as I can in there for you. And thank you again so much for watching. I hope that you found this helpful. If you did, hit the subscribe button down below. Again, the palette is on the way. It should be arriving at my door any minute now, and I will be doing everything you need to know about this palette in the future. So if you don't want to miss that full-length video, definitely subscribe, and mad love to you, and I will see you in a video very, very soon.